Welcome back to MythVision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. I am joined by a Hebrew Bible scholar and expert, especially on Genesis. And we're going to talk about some of that today. We're here to discuss the new insights to the Hebrew Bible lecture series that many scholars are going to participate. And Dr. David Carr is joining us today. He's also going to be part of that series. Welcome back to welcome to MythVision, not back to, but welcome to MythVision.
It's really a pleasure to join you. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you. Thank you. Look, you've written quite a few books on Amazon. People can go check out. And if you don't mind, can you introduce yourself to our audience, just so I don't make the mistake of saying something that I'm not aware of, so people know your expertise and your background?
Sure. That's very gracious of you. So I'm a professor of Hebrew Bible at Union Theological Seminary in New York. And I actually didn't work in my dissertation on Genesis, but my second book was focused on Genesis, called Reading the Fractures of Genesis. It was published a full 30 years ago, which I realize really dates me. But that sort of launched me on an ongoing journey of being fascinated by the complex process that the book of Genesis and other biblical books went through to reach their present form, and just exploring that more and seeing new insights. And here, 30 years later, I still am seeing things I didn't see before.
That's how I feel about it when I'm reading different scholars from different views. And of course, I'm not an expert. So I'm able to go to a buffet and read. So I had some questions lined up. I hope everyone will take the time, go in the description, sign up for the lecture series on new insights of the Hebrew Bible. You're helping us out as well. I'm an affiliate with Bart Ehrman here, and we're trying to get more people to learn, educate themselves, and understand the biblical texts better. That's what we do here at MythVision. So, Dr. Carr, I'm going to be reading the questions, so bear with me here. I don't want to butcher them. Your work shows Genesis as a layered text built from older traditions. When we compare the creation and flood stories, the seams, contradictions, and doublets, in some places triplets, are everywhere. From your perspective, what do these tensions actually reveal about how Israel's earliest scriptures were formed? And what does this tell us about the communities behind them?
Yeah, that's such an interesting question. You know, many people who've studied these texts all their lives, and they've often seen some of those seams and contradictions you're talking about, but they kind of bracket them out. They're kind of noise or whatever. But, people have been seeing these for a long time and trying to explain them in different ways. I know this isn't news to you, but for your audience, just to know, like already 250 years ago, scholars uncovered how the first 11 chapters or the broader Torah were formed out of multiple sources that probably stood independent of each other, maybe even one source being originally written to erase the other, and now they're put together. Or places where scribes took an earlier tradition and radically changed it through adding to it in one way or another. There's this whole complex history. And one thing that's striking about the people who put our text together is they don't seem to have been preoccupied with trying to cover their tracks. They left a lot of these doublets and disagreements there for us to uncover. Now, we can't uncover every detail. This is one place where I'm a little different than some of my colleagues. I really do think there's a limit to how much we can reconstruct, and we're just so lucky to be able to reconstruct as much as we think we can. But then there's whole elements of this fractured history that we'll never be able to uncover. But even with the part we can uncover, to your question of sort of what this tells us about the ancient scribes, is it sort of helps us see how deeply devoted to tradition they were, even when they disagreed with it. Like in our contemporary world, I think there's a tendency for people like to say, they read an ancient text or a new text and they say, do I agree with this? Great. Do I disagree with it? It goes in the waste bin, But with them, they could take an ancient tradition that was sort of in their culture's bloodstream. And even when they disagreed with it, they would just expand it. But they'd expand it in some strategic way that took it in a completely different direction. Or they might write their own version that echoed lots of elements of the earlier version they disagreed with, but refute it in fundamental ways. And so what this does for me, among other things, is it shows me how the Bible isn't a conversation stopper. It's sort of a conversation opener. It's this interplay of diverse texts arguing with each other, debating with each other, within a context where that tradition is really valued.
I love that. You see it in like modern rabbinic literature. They debate each other and argue, right? So if you almost work backwards from what we know, and then you see, I think Seth L. Sanders said something to me about that once where he kind of implied he thinks that there may be even in the Babylonian Talmud an idea of how rabbis and Jews wrestled with their text, that you could kind of anachronistically suppose that that idea still went on way back here. But, maybe someday I'll talk to him and you further on that in depth. Dr. Carr, my second question is, one of the big questions my audience wrestles with is the mythic material behind the Adam and Eve story. The name of my channel is MythVision, and we love finding myths that helped inspire, might be behind some of these texts. When you look at Genesis 2-3 critically, what either traditions do you think, what kind of traditions do you think this narrative is drawing on? I recently read Adam, Eve, and the Devil by Mauro Corpel and Johannes de Moor, where they argue that our Ugaritic myths, especially the stories of El and Asherah in a divine garden on the slopes of Ararat, the rebellious god Horon being cast down, and the serpent figure lie behind the Eden narrative. They even suggest Adam was originally a kind of fell divine emissary tasked with restoring life on earth. From your perspective, how seriously should we take these Canaanite and Mesopotamian parallels, and what do you see as the most plausible ancient antecedents for the Eden story specifically? And I know that this is a debated issue even in their book. There are people that don't agree with them on this interpretation. They think it's just a magical spell or something like that. What is your thoughts about that example? And then if you don't necessarily draw the conclusion, maybe some other mythic parallels, or what do you think inspired it?
Yeah, I have to admit that I have not read this book. I've been focused on a book that I just deposited with Cambridge University Press called Unmaking Eden, Genesis and the Domestication of the World, which my talk at the conference will be particularly focused on. But they are both very reputable, interesting scholars, so I'll have to check it out. I do think that Ugaritic literature could be a really useful fund for finding precursors. It comes from an ancient city, Ugarit, that was on the coast, ancient sort of Phoenicia, broadly construed, and that's pretty close to Israel's, and it was pretty close in time. So, it could well be that some of these kinds of motifs would find their way into the Bible. For me, up till now, not having read their work,
Right.
One of the things that I do find powerful about Ugaritic material as a precursor to the Garden of Eden story is the motif in the Akhat epic of the figure Akhat refusing the goddess Anat's offer of immortality when she wants his bow. That theme of a human loss of a chance at immortality is quite central to the Garden of Eden story. That's what happens to humans when they eat of the tree of knowledge, is God says, they became too godlike. I've got to send them out of the garden before they eat of the tree of life and gain eternal life the way I have. So that actually was also a major motif, the idea of the sort of mortal boundary between humans and gods of Mesopotamian literature, of Gilgamesh losing the opportunity at the plant of eternal life. I know you know all this with your podcast, but just bringing this together,
Yes,
or various other places where Adapa, for example, also refuses the food of immortality. This idea that humans sort of had a chance at immortality and lost it in Mesopotamia and also in Ugarit is at the core of the Garden of Eden story. But it works it out in its own way. And that's sort of the interesting biblical twist. Or another thing, just since you asked more broadly about precursors to the Garden of Eden story, is the theme of humans emerging from a sort of childlike existence and this is true in various Sumerian stories, like the Sumerian story of the grain and the sheep, or the rulers of Lagash. But it's also present in sort of a miniature version in the Enkidu episode of the Gilgamesh epic, that you become human through, emerging from a childlike existence. And that's exactly what happens to humans in Eden. They're naked and unashamed, like children at the beginning. And then they eat of the tree of knowledge, and their eyes are opened, and they suddenly get self-conscious about their nakedness and gradually move toward adult life outside the garden and the hard life of farming and childbearing that's involved there. So there are just all sorts of ways in which, sort of subtly interwoven through the Garden of Eden story, there are these questions around human mortality and human maturity and where did we get this hard life, that are in common with a variety of literature found in Mesopotamia and Ugarit. And those are the types of precursors so far that I definitely see submerged in the Garden of Eden story. Not so much that author is trying to dialogue with a very specific myth. But maybe I could be persuaded by the book. I continue to learn, and that's one thing I love about the field I'm in.
That's what I love about scholars like you, is we're all learning. It's a dialogue. Question 3, Dr. Carr. Most discussions of Genesis focus on its Mesopotamian and Canaanite background, as you discussed. But some scholars have suggested that certain Greek myths or motifs may also echo in these early biblical stories. So we're talking, let's just go beyond Genesis 1 through 11 and let's just say the whole book of Genesis. Given your expertise on how texts develop through cross-cultural contact, do you think any Greek mythic material could have influenced or preceded elements in Genesis? And if so, if any, do you take seriously? Please let me know. Or do you see the Greek parallels as later coincidental or simply part of a broader ancient Mediterranean mythic repertoire?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. And I do think that our field has been characterized by a little bit of a blind spot when it comes to Greek literature, because frankly, there's a limit to how much language competence many biblical scholars can get. And so we more naturally learn languages that are more closely related to Hebrew and more similar, like ancient Akkadian or other kinds of things. And so those sorts of cultures have had a privileged place as comparison points. And frankly, in terms of the creation and flood narratives of Genesis, there's so much rich material there that people have really focused on that. And they haven't developed the kind of linguistic or other expertise to really explore possible Greek parallels. And so I do think, one has to be really careful about that. I would say overall, I may be suffering from that blind spot myself here. I have to be fully self-disclosive in that way, but I haven't found the same number of clear, rich parallels to Greek literature in Genesis 1 to 11 as I do, especially to Mesopotamian origin accounts, and to a lesser extent, Ugaritic or Neo-Hittite. It just seems like there's a lot more very specific and interesting parallels. But there is one possible exception, and it's broadly discussed. And there's this little nugget, fascinating story in Genesis 6, 1 to 4, about how the sons of God saw the daughters of humanity, saw that they were beautiful, took them as wives, and before they even have a chance to have kids, God says, wait a minute, my spirit can't abide in them forever. I'll set their age limit at 120 years. And then we hear that the giants were in the land at the time, and also the great heroes of antiquity. So in a sense, this is describing divine human pairings and a worry by the deity that they might be immortal. And then God preventing that by setting a life limit, an incredibly long life limit by ancient standards, even by contemporary standards, of 120 years. But that's that. They'll be semi-divine, but they won't live past 120 years. But they, become giants and great heroes in later periods. This does sound a lot like the Age of the Heroes that Hesiod talks about, where you have divine human pairings and heroes that are immortal, and are bigger than everybody else and that sort of thing. So there are actually also parallels to parts of that story in Mesopotamian and Hittite materials. So it again may be a question of broader sorts of themes that we can see. But I wouldn't completely rule out that we might have some echoes that are already present. I mean, Greeks had trade routes linking with Phoenician cities that were just a few miles away from ancient Israelite heartland areas. And we have, Greek ware that's found in various cities in the Shephelah and elsewhere. So it's very plausible, even before the Hellenistic period of Alexander the Great, very plausible that we could have had some cultural interaction that would have contributed to texts like Genesis 6:1-4. So that's the place where I see the most possibilities.
Yeah, there's so much there. Wish we had more time, but I'm reminded of the work of Bruce Loudon. Sadly, he passed of cancer, and his study was Ancient Near East and Homer. And in his book, he talks about the Greek myth, and he doesn't argue for like a genetic. He tries to have like an intermediary. He thinks they have a common source or something like that, an intermediate source in the opening. But yeah, I think he might have been looking toward the Phoenicians. There's so much overlap between like Jacob and Laban and like Jason and the Argonauts and all sorts of interesting stuff. It's also, like you said, a lot of scholars don't really even probably know those stories in depth due to the linguistic and cultural differences. And they're usually, I mean, ever since like a lot of the academics have found, pre-Bible flood stories in Mesopotamia, that's been like the main focus, right? So there's so much to explore. I love this stuff. Thank you for your answer.
Yeah.
Did you want to comment on that before I move to the next question, or are you?
No, just what you described sounds like a really smart way to think through these issues.
Thank you. Number 4 is you've argued that Israelite literature developed in conversation with and sometimes in deliberate resistance to Mesopotamian myths. When we look at Genesis 1-11, do you see Israel adapting, competing with, or subverting myths like the Atrahasis or the Epic of Gilgamesh? I'm happy to go with all of Genesis, anywhere in all of it if you want to, but is there anywhere that you see a more direct? I might have Joel Baden on, right? And Joel Baden will go, well, I think it's a not direct, but I think without it, you wouldn't have Genesis. So they have like steps between, they think, what's going on. Do you think Genesis is directly engaging with any particular text?
I think one of the places I see the best case to be made for that sort of thing, and I'll mention a problem with this later, is Genesis 1, the 7-day creation account, where God, as you know, says, "Let there be light," and there was light. Let there be a hammered dome. I know the traditional translations say firmament, but a dome separating the upper oceans from the lower oceans, and it was there, and it goes through step by step, God speaking like a king, really speaking into existence, different parts of the cosmic order, culminating in the creation of humans to rule over all the other creatures. Anyway, one thing that I'm not at all the first person to see this, but there are point by point ways in which this story seems to echo and yet subvert the Enuma Elish epic, which talks about the supreme power of the Babylonian god Marduk. And so I just think, Marduk speaks into existence constellations and then takes them out of existence. Marduk creates humans to serve the gods, and this is the way in which the Enuma Elish echoes earlier Mesopotamian myths of Atrahasis. Creates humans to be the slaves of other gods. And there are various ways, and Marduk also sort of separates the upper and lower oceans by killing the goddess Tiamat and making her body into a roof that keeps the upper oceans at bay. That's and Genesis does a version of that with the firmament or dome. I'm just kind of scratching the surface of all the different parallels, and yet it's God who is the supreme power in Genesis 1, not Marduk. And there's no other gods whatsoever that even come into play in in the Genesis 1 account. In fact, their gods are so much not existent in the Genesis 1 account as opposed to the Enuma Elish that you just use a generic word, Hebrew word for God, Elohim, to refer to God. It's just like, what else? What other name? What other thing could apply for this word than God? It's just this. This text just erases Marduk and the Mesopotamian pantheon in talking about the supreme power of the one and only God of Israel. And in that way, I just think it's a fascinating example of the way the Bible is in dialogue, possibly, with the Mesopotamian tradition. The qualification I told you I'd come with, and here, I'm being a typical academic, talking about different sides of things, but is that scholars, Assyriologists, my colleagues in Assyriology, have pointed out the Enuma Elish epic is actually a fairly esoteric text within the Mesopotamian curriculum. It wasn't widely circulated. It was sort of very advanced study. So it's not exactly clear the vector by which Israelite scribes would have been exposed to the motifs and themes that seem to so specifically come up again in Genesis 1. That's a big unknown. But there's enough connections there that my inclination is to think somehow it happened, maybe by way of some intermediaries that we don't have access to, or maybe somehow more directly. And that's one of the many places where we wish we knew more, and maybe we will someday.
And just to tease on that, I know these are layers, but would you say Genesis 1 is post-exilic likely?
I would say it's either late exilic or early post-exilic. And if it's post-exilic, I'd still tend to put it in the diaspora when many Judeans were in forced migration in Babylonia, as opposed to after they'd returned.
I only ask because I know, like, Seth L. Sanders has the idea that scribes, there was a scribal school in Persia that, like, the Persians fought against, if you will, the leadership, and they ended up getting kicked out. Their families got kicked out, and they were replaced by people from the Yehud. And so here, these people would have maybe, I mean, this is all hypothetical, of course, maybe had access to this material and translations and things, and they're dealing with Babylonian material that, the Persians inherited. So I don't know. I mean, it's just something to chew on, maybe. Okay. I'm having too much fun, and I don't want to waste. How much time do we have? I think I have like 9 minutes. One of your major contributions is applying trauma theory to biblical literature. How does viewing Genesis as a response to collective trauma, exile, displacement, imperial domination, etc., help us understand why these stories were written the way they were?
Yeah. This has just also proven such a rich vein for me studying. As I was mentioning earlier in my self-intro, I was studying the formation of Genesis 30 years ago and following the tracks of many previous scholars, where you look at the doublets and fractures and all that sort of thing to try to uncover different sources, and in many ways trying to look at what the Bible says to uncover its origins. But a variety of sort of personal events led me into study of trauma in psychology, sociology, and other things, in ways in which both individuals and groups who've suffered trauma often have a lot of trouble speaking directly about those experiences. They'll speak of them briefly as if they happened to someone else or to another person, another group, or they won't speak of them at all, or they won't be able to remember them at all. And so in some ways, trauma leaves its mark in what is not said. In the swerves, the indirection, not what is directly said. And that sort of took me down a whole different path in terms of studying the early formation of the Bible. Was not only looking at the stuff that's obvious, like the descriptions of the Assyrians or the Babylonians and the prophets and that sort of thing, but also looking at the gaps. So, for example, the broader biblical history goes from the creation of the world in Genesis 1 all the way up to Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of Jerusalem and burning the temple and the exile of Judeans into Babylon. And then it goes quiet for another 50 years, more or less, until the king Persia arises to destroy the Babylonian kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar and start allowing Judeans to return to their homeland. That gap in communal memory is analogous in many ways to the gap that people who suffered trauma, or even groups that have suffered trauma, go through. And I think it reveals a lot about the impact of the Babylonian exile on biblical literature. And so you can see that in the gap, but I think you can also see it in the focus that really arises during the exile and afterward, the focus on Israel's pre-land history, the stories of the patriarchs, the story of Moses and the Israelites in Egypt before they had a land. Although those stories are not about Babylonian exile, they parallel it. And so it can sort of, it became a way, those stories, which I don't believe were invented during the exile, they were older traditions, but they get revived and expanded and rehashed in the exile as a way of processing a trauma that people can't speak of directly. And so that starts to become part of the untold story of these old stories. You kind of start to read them on two levels, that this story is not just about Abraham and Sarah. It's about unnamed Judean exiles who are finding themselves isolated in a foreign land, feeling vulnerable, wondering if there's a future for them. And this story voices God's promise to them indirectly. Anyway, I think things like that help us sort of see the hidden traumatic background to the Bible, and maybe also understand a little bit of its ongoing power and resilience. That is, you know, we're reading the Bible in various cultures of the West and beyond now, whereas many of the other kinds of myths that you focus on in your podcast, you know, Atrahasis and Gilgamesh and so on, were only rediscovered from the sands of archaeological finds 150 years ago. And I think part of the power of the Bible for people over generations has been the fact that it was written out of this communal experience of trauma and survival of it. And I think even people who don't know the details of that ancient history can sense the deeper music, in a sense, of that recovery from trauma and find something in it for themselves. Because people never stopped, of course, experiencing trauma, whether as individuals or communities. And there's a way in which the Bible, kind of between the lines, speaks to that experience.
I think that also would be a great segue to a question I don't have about apocalypticism, because I think trauma would make a lot of sense along with, you know, hope of future success or a changed world, the problem of evil in light of that. But that's for a different time. I would like to, I'm going to skip the next question because we only have 4 minutes here. And I just want to say, I came from a world, Dr. Carr, where Genesis was taken literally, you know, young earth creationist. I wasn't a flat earther now. I'll give you that. But because I don't know, I just never bought into that. But I could see why people who start reading it carefully would, if they are like biblical literalist. But so you got the 6 days, talking snakes, global floods, the whole package, as you know. Many in my audience were raised in the same way. Based on everything you've uncovered about Genesis, how Genesis was formed, its layers, contradictions, and ancient Near Eastern parallels, what do you think is the most honest way to approach this material? How can we help people move beyond literalism and actually see what these texts are instead of catering to misunderstandings or inherited ignorance?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think one of the things I've found over the years is I've worked with many people coming from backgrounds like that and various other ones too. I've worked with a lot of different folks, is it often works to start with a yes rather than a no. So I often, when I'm talking about this, don't emphasize how, everything you believed is untrue. The Bible's, you know, a fiction or that sort of thing. Maybe that works for some people, but I often like the work on trauma that I was talking about a minute ago, to talk about how the Bible encompasses within itself a whole variety of deeper truths that were found by people, you know, living their lives and retelling the stories over and over again. Because the Bible really is in many ways the filtered product of the stories that really had a ongoing significance to people who were living life. And those truths, the truths, you know, they had no video camera to tell whether something happened or not at a given time in the past, but they did know their present life, and they did want to say some things about how God was relating to them then. And so my emphasis often is on looking at what can the Bible tell us of the truth those later audiences were experiencing. Why are people still reading this text and finding it so powerful? It's not because you could take a video camera back and see Moses partying the sea, the way it's described in Exodus 14. The thing that takes people back to the Bible over and over again is the power that it testifies to God's power over the pharaohs of the world. Not just the Pharaoh of ancient Egypt, but the pharaohs they were later experiencing in Mesopotamia and elsewhere, because pharaohs, of course, never go away either. So I just think, back to your question, I try to take the love people have when they still have it. Some people are deeply wounded by the Bible too, of course, right. but to try to say, that can take you into looking at how the Bible is a product of this ongoing process. And you can find a deeper truth there too.
Yeah, I agree. I think sometimes if we confront head on in a literalist way, cognitive dissonance might set in. And then, your approach is a more gentle one, I think, and allows them to still negotiate with it in a way where they don't feel like it's all or nothing. And it's like, yes. Okay, hold on. I like your approach. Is there any final words before we do our quick little promo for everybody to go get this sign up for the lecture series?
No, these have been such great questions. I could tell from your questions that you really do know this field and also my work. So thank you so much for prepping it. And I would just do my own little promo if I could for this book, Unmaking Eden, Genesis and Domestication of the World, which is not out yet. Will come out in the fall, but I'll give a little preview at this conference, and I hope to see folks there.
Well, I hope that everyone goes and signs up. Dr. Carr, we have much to do, I think, if you're available, of course. I would love to dive into this new book when you have it released where we can discuss this further. But everyone, there is going to be a conference, and Dr. Carr is going to be there along with a whole spectrum of brilliant minds and amazing people that are going to contribute to bringing education on biblical topics, Hebrew Bible, and ancient Near Eastern studies as well. There are some Assyriologists that are going to show up with biblical awareness, of course, as well. Their scholarship's great. So you're helping us out if you sign up, and the link will be in the description. There are various categories by which you could sign up as well. I believe there's VIP. So you have standard, VIP, and elite. Be sure to check out the links and get in there. Sign up. I can't wait to see everybody there. Thank you for your time, Dr. Carr.
Thank you so much, Derek. It's a pleasure.